Hello and welcome everyone to this Skills Kickstart session for Recipe Management Basics for Beer. My name is Alex Luna. I am a customer enablement specialist here at Encompass. I've been with the company for over 3.5 years. I started as a support analyst and then moved into the customer enablement role, where I've worked with pretty much everything under the sun, from warehouse, logistics, sales and delivery, and production and e-commerce. So, really happy to get into this with you today. So, for today's agenda, what we are going to be talking about is we are first going to start about talking the difference between recipe versions, recipe stages, and recipe components. I'm going to show you a little overview of all three of those and how they relate to one another, and then I'm going to dive a little deeper into each one of them and what they represent in the recipe management. Then we're going to chat a little bit about production stage types and how those tie into recipe stages. We're going to then briefly chat about turns and how we can configure them in the system, as well as the difference of when we use them for recipe versions and recipe stages. Then, towards the end, we're going to chat about single whip versus multiple whip and how those build out our recipe versions and how they tie into our recipe theory to make sure that we are getting our versions to as close to true life as possible, so that way we're not making any manual changes. Alrighty. So, the first thing I want to take us to is the diagram that I have created. The ones that we're going to mainly be focusing on is going to be the recipe versions, recipe stages, and recipe components there on the right-hand side. But I just want to show you how they all go into one another and how they all connect. The other thing I want to point out is the other tables that connect to the recipe stages field. So as you can see there from the recipe stages, we move into the production stage types, equipment types table, as well as the equipment types, the equipment, the production stage types, and even the QC templates and QC target group are attached to that. So the main reason I want to call that out is just because in that recipe stage, as we begin talking about it, there are many other tables that are going to link to it and that are going to power it from the back end. So making sure we have that configured as far as the equipment types, that again, that long name of the production stage types, equipment types table, all that is configured on the back end and set up. It is going to feed into our recipe stage, and we're going to talk about how it does that and what it looks like from the dashboard and those table views. So hang tight, we're going to get to that in the demo, but I just want to show you a visualization of what it does look like and how they all link to one another. So to get us started, we're going to start talking about the recipe versions versus the recipe stages versus the recipe components. Now, when we're thinking about this as a high level, we first have those recipe versions. We want these to be our master templates, or if we're thinking of real life, we want to think of this as the entry in our cookbook. So think of it a cookbook, it's our entry into it. We may have a meatloaf that we're preparing to make or something else, but is our high level entry. It is going to be the total vision of that final product. So this is going to tell the system what we are going to make and just which product it is. Now, as we break that down, we have our recipe stages. These are going to be the specific steps that we have within that recipe version. So this could be our boil stage, our prep stage. If we're thinking cookbook, we may have our prep or our mixing stage and then our finishing stage. Now, within that recipe stage, we do have our recipe components. These are going to be the ingredients of the recipe. So this is really where we get a lot more granular, and these can be physical ingredients like water, sugar, yeast, or it could be specific instructions or the order of operations where we may need to stir at this specific time or we need to add milk at this specific time. So those are going to be our instructions and our ingredients. Now we are going to dive a little bit deeper into each one of these. So I'm going to start with the recipe versions. Again, this is the master template. We can also think of this as our blueprint or just the brain of the operation. So when we are creating these recipe versions, the best practice is to always name your recipe version so that way it matches your end product. If we are having 5 different ways to make the same IPA, we want to make sure that we're using a clear identifier so that way your team isn't guessing which one we're going to pull. Now, we'll also be able to categorize these by recipe types. Now, we're going to see this a little bit later in the table, but what a recipe type is it's going to identify what we are actually doing in that recipe version. So the main two that we may have is our production and our packaging. Production is going to be when we are actually creating the liquid or the whip, whereas the packaging could be getting that packaged or that finished product out the door and packaged. There are a few other ones that we can go through. I believe there is a maintenance, and it really just depends on what your um, warehouse or operations is doing. Now, with recipe versions, the other great thing with this is it's going to help your material forecasting just to help you identify those data points. That way, it tells you exactly how much grain or hops we're going to need to order for next month. So, again, recipe version from a high level is that master template that is telling us everything about it pretty much. Now, as we get a little bit more granular, we do have our recipe stages. We are going to break these down into the sequential steps that we're going to see. Now, these steps can be included, like you see here on the screen, where we have the amount of time, the equipment, the inventory needed, the whip in progress or the whip completion, and the byproducts. So, when we are creating the stages, the best practice is to really include both the product and the stage in the name. So that way we're not just saying, hey, this is the boil stage. Since we're using that IPA example, we want to say this is the West Coast IPA boil stage. That way it's going to make our data a lot more searchable and just going to help keep things crystal clear. So that way when you're looking at a long list of production orders, you're not having to go and find which one or find which stage that you are really trying to find, like trying to get to. Now, in this section, I also want to briefly touch on turns and the turnable setting because they are different in the recipe stage and the recipe version. Now, as a high level, because we are going to talk about this here in a second, what turnable means is it is just telling the system and it's allowing the system to help you plan for multiple batches. So if you set turnable to true, we are going to be telling the system, I need to do this twice or back to back. Whereas on the flip side, if we turn it to false, the system won't duplicate the time or the step. It just is going to double the components and the planned units. So don't worry too much about turns. We're going to talk about that here in a second, but just a high level, that's what it was going to do for the recipe stages. Now, at our most granular level, we have our recipe components. These, again, are going to be the guts or the ingredients of your recipe. So, with every component, it is going to start with a source product or a raw material. This can range from anywhere between our malt to our flavorings to just water if we need to add water to it. Now, with those planned units or our planned components, we can define them as planned units and with a unit of measure. So that way we know exactly what we are pulling from our stock. For example, that could be like 30 barrels as our planned unit and unit measure, or 10 liters for that. Now, components don't just have to be physical ingredients. They can also be our set of instructions. So these are going to serve as that digital SOP for your team on the floor. So during each stage, the operator is going to know and have a clear step-by-step guide on exactly what to do and when to do it. Now, the other thing that recipe components do is it allows us to track the byproducts. In a modern brewery, nothing should be invisible. So whether we're tracking spent grain for a local farmer, if we are second runnings for a different project, or even if we're harvesting yeast for your next batch, we are treating these as valuable outputs. So by tracking these, we are ensuring that these are accounted for rather than just them disappearing down the drain. So now we're going to move into production stage types. Production stage types is where I mentioned in the diagram how it links to the recipe stage area. So again, from that recipe stage area, we had our production stage types, equipment types, and then that branched out to stage types, equipment, and equipment types. So again, I just wanted to talk about this because it is really important of how we get these stages into a production order. Now, starting with the stage type, this is going to act as the bridge between your recipe and your physical floor. So if we are thinking of a mashing stage, Because that stage is linked to a specific equipment or a specific type of equipment, the system already knows which vessels in your facility are actually going to be capable of doing that mashing. So when we're setting up an order, the system is going to give us a curated dropdown of the right equipment for the specific job that we are doing. So as we can see in the graphic there, we have a lot of equipment that is tied to a bunch of different categories. We may have equipment tied to fermentation, to filtering, and to our packaging. Now, we know production isn't always one to one, so this setup allows you to tie more than one piece of equipment to a single stage, and it's going to give you the flexibility to manage those complex seller flows or even multi-vessel transfer seamlessly. Now, again, this is really important for our recipe stages because from that recipe stage, as we're going to see here in the demo, we're going to be able to click that stage type and it is going to populate all that equipment for us on the back end that we have already set up. So that is why it's really important to have this set up and configured how we want it to be. And just like I promised, we are going to talk about turns right now. So we're going to talk about how we can handle turns. Well, we are thinking about this on our two different sides. We have our brewhouse side and our cellar side, and we're going to chat about the brewhouse side first. So I like to call the brewhouse side the hot side, and we are going to be using these turnable stages. So if we are thinking about our mash or our lauter and our boil, if we have let's say we have a 30 barrel brew house, but we are wanting to fill a 120 barrel fermentation vessel, we are going to run that process 4 times. But instead of you having to create 4 separate production orders, the system is just going to repeat those specific stages multiple times within a single batch because we are using turnable stages. Now, you'll notice later in the demo that we can define the output per turn. So if we're aiming for 30 barrels in the fermenter, we might actually need to brew 36.5 barrels in the kettle just to help account for that loss through the process. So by setting active for turnable, the amount, the system is going to handle the scaling, the inventory, pulls for each turn automatically, so that way our actuals stay accurate and so what's actually happening in the pipes. Now, as we move to our cellar side, which is the cold side, things change to a lot more of the non-turnable stages. We aren't going to we aren't going to be repeating the fermentation 4 times because that is in the fermentation process. That is just going to sit there, that is going to ferment. So we aren't needing to turn that over or repeat it. Now, we are building up that volume until the tank is at full capacity. So once that tank hits 120 barrels and the tank is full, then the process is going to stay as a single block of time for fermentation. Then it's going to go with the process and we're going to move it into our bright tank and then eventually into packaging. So again, on that cold side or the cellar side, there isn't too much turns that is happening, especially in the stages. Now, lastly, before we get into our demo, I'm just going to quickly chat about single whip versus multiple whip and how that ties into our recipe theory. So, how I like to think about this is coinciding with the life cycle of a brew. So most of the time, we are going to be using our single whip approach. This is going to be your grain to glass standard. So if we think of our flagships or our core products like our core pilsners, our core IPAs, that recipe is going straight from the grain silo all the way to the bright beer in one single shot. We aren't editing it, we aren't making changes because we know it's such a popular and well trafficked product. So we have that production recipe version for the liquid and then a packaging recipe version to put it in cans or kegs. It is a simple from start to finish, nothing else going into it, a single whip. But we know that brewing isn't always a straight line. A lot of people like to experiment. A lot of people like to play around with flavors. So sometimes we need to pivot. And that's where the multiple whip versions come in. So the multiple whip version is going to allow you to split a single batch into multiple different products at a specific point in the process. An example here is we might be brewing a large base of our sour beer, but we are going to split it. So from that sour beer base, we are going to put half of it into a cherry fruiting stage and the other half into a raspberry stage. Now, we may be doing this with an IPA as well. So maybe we are splitting our IPA batch to experiment with two different dry hop varietals instead. So again, we're splitting that into multiple whips. Now, by using these multiple whips, we are able to track each of those unique outputs as their own distinct products while we are still linked to that original parent brew. Now, how this relates into recipe theory is what I want to get into next, and how it ties into our master template and our master blueprint, excuse me, just because we are going to be adding some stuff to our single whip. So, with recipe theory, how I want us to look at this is from a zoomed out lens. We want to think of that as our master blueprint and our master template. So, the biggest piece of advice here I have is the closer to perfect you get your template, then the less manual work you're going to have to do later. So, when we pull this template into a production order, everything, the timing, the cost, the materials, all that is already going to be there for you. So, with that, since we have our recipe version to how we want it, we can also use finished goods as a component for a new recipe. This is pretty essential for things like converting cases into variety mix packs or repacking larger vessels into smaller ones. A good example of that would be if a bar downtown calls and they're really desperate for a six barrel, which we also call a sixtel, of your newest brew. So let's say we go check the cooler. Maybe they wanted that new cherry sour that we were doing. So we go check the cooler and we only have half barrels left. So how we can kind of manipulate this is we can use the recipe version to solve it. What we would do is in the recipe version, we would have the recipe consume that half barrel as a component. Then we are going to use our three empty sixtels, and that is then going to result in our full sixtels. So even so, once we get those full sixtels out, we can even track the empty half barrel as a byproduct. So that way it goes back to your packaging team and they can get it back into the cleaning rotation. So really, it's all about making your inventory work for you, even if plans change or they kind of pivot a little bit. Now, again, you've heard me say this multiple times. The recipe theory and the recipe version should just be the main template. It should be that gold standard. So that way we are copying it and building it out so that way it correlates to our specific brand variations. So again, this template should mirror your typical workflow, whether it's going to be converting raw materials into bright beer or repacking finished goods. So again, because we know things change on the fly, you aren't really locked in. You can always go in and make those exceptions. You can make those substitutions on the individual production orders without messing up your master template. So don't be afraid to get that master template and edit it or go in and create those new production orders and make the substitutions, make the flavoring. So again, as long as you have that master template as that gold standard, you are all set there. Now, the final piece of the theory puzzle is going to be the available to promise report, also known as ATP. Now, this is the last thing I'm going to chat about before we get into the demo because I think it is very important. Um, because your recipe versions define exactly what's needed to make a product, the system is going to use that data to look at your current stock and the scheduled receipts to tell you exactly what you can promise to your customers. So it's really not just about what's in the warehouse right now. So we can use the recipe data in the conjunction with lead time days. Then the system can actually look ahead and tell you when you need to order maybe our grain or our hops to meet that future demand. Now, if there is ever an issue with the available to promise, we can always use the batch trace tool. So that way we can trace forward to see which customers received a specific batch or trace backward all the way to the original raw material source. So again, that available to promise report is super handy dandy, super helpful. I recommend going there and checking it out and just getting familiar with that report. Now, before we do jump into our demo, I just wanted to re-show you this diagram just because I did talk about a lot and I'm going to show you a lot of all the tables and how they connect. But as a good visual, I think this is great for us getting into there so you can see how recipe versions tie into recipe stages and how recipe components tie into recipe stages as well. Then we are going to talk about how the four tables that tie to recipe stages are linked and how they power the recipe stage. So again, keep this in mind, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the demo site. Awesome. Gonna move my floating head. There we go. Alrighty. So, from our demo site, we are starting on our recipe versions table. How I got here was I just went to the universal search bar and typed in recipe versions, and I found the version that I wanted to work with. So I know that one of our core loggers is this Bachelor Brew Logger 30 Barrel Bright. So I know that. And from this table record, we are seeing a bunch of different information. We have our product info here at the top. So, what brand family it belongs to, what brand, and the end product that we are making. We also have our planned units and our unit of measure. So, we have 30 barrels that we are producing. Location is just telling us where we are producing this whip or this product. This is pretty important to have just in case you do have multiple facilities or you are making them in different areas. So that's where that location comes into play. And then lastly, here we have that production partner. This is important if we are using a vendor or we are aligning with co-packing. So from here at the bottom, we have a few other pieces of important information. We have our recipe type. Right now, this is set to production. Like I said, production recipe type is just saying that we are making that liquid component. So it is going into our whip. However, if it was a packaging recipe version, then we would have a recipe type of packaging. Maybe we're doing maintenance. So we can change that in that recipe type. Now, the other one I want to call out is the turn configuration method. This is going to determine if the recipe will be completed multiple times or if the recipe stages will be repeated. Okay, so this can be done on the recipe version, as you see here, and on the recipe stage. I'm going to show you a little bit clearer view in the recipe management dashboard how we can turn this on and make sure that the default number of turns actually represents the output that we want. So keep these ones in mind just as we go through, but I just want to show you how you could see them here on the table. Now, if we were to click add recipe version, it would take us to that recipe management dashboard, which is where I highly recommend you go to edit or work with recipe versions. So again, I will show you here at the end, but for right now, I just want to show you how all these tables link together and where all the information does live for them. So from our recipe versions, if I were to click subtables and click recipe stages, I can see all the recipe stages that are tied to this recipe version. Now, there's only three, which is pretty nice. Maybe there's five, maybe there's six, maybe there's more. But for this one, we only have three. So I'm going to go ahead and arrow into one of them just so we can kind of break it down. And the one I arrowed into was our brewing stage. So our first stage in that process. Now, when we start talking about this, we are going to chat about the stage type here in just a little bit, as it regards to production stage types. So I'm not going to go too in depth here on this table, but just keep that in mind and how that stage type represents that is brewing. Now we also have the stage info as far as planned units again, our units of measure, the recipe version it is tied to, which was the one that we just saw, and our whip product. Now, the whip product is going to represent the product created from this stage that will be transferred to the next. So again, our whip product in this stage is going to be the Bachelor's Brew Lager Wort. Now, also on this table, another field that is very important is going to be our lead time. This lead time is set in minutes, but this is really important just to tell the user or tell you that that's how long this stage is going to last. So we have this set for 240 minutes. I'm not a math person. I don't know how many hours that is, but that's going to tell them, hey, this is going to take this much amount of time to complete this stage. We also have the sequence. This is just saying which stage is going first, second, third, so on. I'll show you that a little bit easier here in the recipe management dashboard. And then we also have the turnable and number of turns. These are kind of the stage behavior down here. So this stage is turned to true, and we have a number of turns set to 1. So that means that we are turning this only once, so that way we can get it to that stage completion, and it is set to true. Again, it is a little bit easier to see on that dashboard instead. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and go over to our production stage types tables just so we can talk more about this stage type. Now I could click on it here and it would take me there, but I already have it up in another tab, so I'm just going to do that. So starting from there, we had our stage type of brewing. And again, this is just telling us what we are doing at that stage and what equipment is tied to it and what we are doing to fulfill that equipment. So from here under that brewing, we can see our production stage group. And we also have the equipment that is tied to it. So if this was a stage that included multiple pieces of equipment. Maybe we needed to use some bins as well as some tanks. We would have all that equipment here that is tied to this stage type. So again, this is where it's really important and how this feeds to our recipe stages. Because without this information here, we wouldn't know which type of equipment we're using. We wouldn't know how many of that equipment we're using. We wouldn't know the units or how big it is. We wouldn't know any of that. So making sure that this is configured and set up in your system so that way it ties to our recipe stages, again, so it ties here, is super important to know everything. Now, from recipe stages, if I were to continue down our line and I went to subtables to look at our recipe components, we can see that these are all the ingredients and all the instructions that are tied to this one stage. Now, there are a lot here, so I'm going to again click into one of them just so we can see it more off a one base and kind of see it at one table. So I'm going to go over here and we're going to look at our first recipe component. Now, on our recipe component table, we have a lot of the same information. We have the end product that we are making. We have what recipe version it is tied to, as well as what recipe stage it is in. And then the other important field is this source product. Now, that source product is going to be more of your physical product or your raw material, showing what is actually being inputted into the recipe. So for this one, our source product is going to be malt/rice syrup. Now we also have the planned unit and the unit of measure. So we're saying that 27.50 gallons are going to go into it at this stage. Now it may be at a specific time, it may be right at the beginning, but that amount is going to go in either at that turn or at that specific stage. We also have some pricing information like our laid-in cost. That is going to be the purchase cost of that product, whereas the extended cost is going to be the purchase cost of this product times the planned units. So that's why you're going to see those two different costs there. So I know I talked about a lot in these four tables and how they all connected to each other and just how you can see they all link to one another. But now I want to go into the actual dashboard so we can go and create a brew or we can see how these link more visually to each other. So from my other dashboard here, I'm just starting fresh here. I'm going to go to our production cloud home. This is a great place for anybody who just doesn't know where to start or they just need some help finding specific tables, finding specific dashboards. They can always go here and they can find those pieces of information. Now, if I wanted to, I can go to our ATP report. That's just going to link me directly there. So that's great. And if I wanted to go to the recipe management dashboard, I can come here and click this tab. Now I could also go back to the universal search bar and type it in if I knew how to type, and I can navigate to there as well. So this is our recipe management dashboard, and where we're going to be doing a lot of that changes and just going through our process in a day-to-day warehouse. So If we wanted to, let's say it's a typical week and we need to make our core lager. So we need to go in and we need more of that Bachelor Brew lager. Again, we have made that recipe version so close to perfect. It is perfect that we can go ahead, we can make it as it is. We know it's a great seller. So we are sticking with that recipe. So in our recipe version column here, I'm going to type in Bachelor Brew lager, and I'm going to look for that product. So the Bachelor Brew Lager 30 Barrel Bright. Now from here, I'm going to go ahead and click search. It's going to populate our results down here. And once I click on it, it is then going to fill in the recipe version and all the information that we have for it. So I'm not going to go in too much depth because I'm going to tweak this a little bit. So I'm not going to go too crazy. But I just wanted to show you that if we were doing a simple, straight line process where we had our Bachelor Brew Lager, it's a hard one for me today. If we had that product and we were just going to it, no tweaks, no substitutions, this is how it would work. We had that master template. We're not changing anything. So we're going to follow these stages and these components just as they would. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to go into our brewing stage. It's turnable once. It's going to take 4 hours, and we're going to go through our components. Now, the one thing I will mention while we are just here is when we are looking at the recipe components right here, we have two different colors. We have this light gray and this white color. Now, what this represents is the light gray is going to be the instructions that they are doing, and the white is the actual product or the source product that they are inputting into the recipe. So on that sort or on that instruction, we have that we need the water to grist ratio to be this. We need our strike water temp to be at a certain amount. Our mash temp needs to be at this certain temperature. So those are the instructions. Now, the one thing I do want to mention when it comes to making instructions like this is when your users are using the handheld or Encompass mobile app to go through the production stages and just complete the production order, they have to go individually and complete each set of instructions. So on their Encompass mobile, they would see, hey, we have that memo of water to grist ratio. They need to make sure that that is correct and good. Then they could click confirm and it would take them to their next set of instructions where we need a strike water temp. Once that is good, they'll be able to click next and it'll take them here. So that's the difference with instructions is it goes on a one by one basis and your users have to manually click through it and show that they are completing that component. Now, if they just needed to add these four ingredients, that's just going to say, hey, add this ingredient, and this ingredient at the same time. So that way they can do that all at once. So from here, we kind of see how it all is represented. We have our recipe version, our recipe stages, and then our recipe components within that stage. But we completed this. We knew it's a bestseller. So we wanted to try something a little bit different. We know that spring is approaching and we like to play around with flavors. So let's say that I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a blackberry lime lager instead. Now, I know our lager recipe is amazing, so I'm going to keep that, but I'm just going to tweak it a little bit and make some flavoring substitutions. So in order to do that, we can go back to this left-hand side menu and I'm going to click create or add recipe version right here. From here, I can input all the information I need. So from my recipe version, we like this naming convention to be as close as possible. So I'm going to say that it is a blackberry lime lager. Whoops, 30 barrels. Now, our location, like I said, is pretty important if you have multiple areas or multiple facilities. I'm just doing this in our production facility, so I'm going to keep that there. And the product, since I know that our Bachelor Brew is a high seller and it sells really well, I'm going to keep that as the same product. Again, this is the end product, so I'm just saying that it is the Bachelor Brew Bright Beer. I'm going to keep our recipe type as production because we are going to be making the liquid components, so we aren't packaging or anything. So I'm going to make sure that it is the production to show the whip. And then we can come down here to our planned units and our units of measure. Now, I was lucky and the units of measure already defaulted to barrels, but if I needed to change this, I could. But again, it's there for me, so I'm going to keep it. And I know that I want to do 30 barrels. Now, production partner, I'm going to leave blank just because we don't have a co-packer, so I'm not going to do anything with that. I'm going to leave it blank. And now the really cool thing about this is even though we are changing the recipe version and we are adding a flavor to it, we know that it is going to be linked to our base Bachelor Brew logger. So I can use this area right here and type in Bachelor Brew. And what this is going to do is it is going to copy the recipe stages and all the recipe components from that original Bachelor Brew logger and just add it to our new recipe version. So that way we're not going in and having to re-add everything, especially because we know that original logger is so well kept. That is a good one. So from there, I'm going to go ahead and click Add Recipe Version. Great. Now I'm just going to collapse this side menu just to make sure it looks a little bit bigger for us and that way you can see it. Awesome. Now from here, we're going to go through each piece of those informations just on a little different basis so you can kind of see it compared to that table. Again, it's all the same information and it's all here. So at the very top, we have those recipe versions. We changed the recipe version name just to that blackberry lime lager, but everything else stayed the same. We have our product, our recipe type, our location, if we had a production partner. The only new things that we are seeing here that we also saw on the table is this active status, which is just saying that we are currently in the process of making this product. Our output per turn. So this is just saying per turn, we are making 30 barrels. And we have our turn configuration method and the default number of turns. So our turn configuration method, this is set to production order, which is great. But let's say if we went back to our scenario and we're not wanting to make just 30 barrels, we want our output to be 120 barrels instead. So, how we would use the turn on our recipe version is I would go to our default number of turns and I would change this to 4 instead of 1. And that's going to show that we are now going to make 120 total barrels in this recipe version. So, we're going to have 30 barrels per turn, but our total output is going to be 120 because we are turning this 4 times. Now that also updated our costs and our stages and our recipe components, which is great news for us. So we're going to continue with that. Now going down to our recipe stages, I'm going to collapse these just so we can kind of see the stages for one. So we have 3 stages. We have our brewing stage, our fermenting stage, and our brightening beer stage. Going into our first stage of brewing, we have a lot of the same information that we've seen before. We have the name. So again, this is the Blackberry Lime Lager in our brewing stage. We have that stage type. Again, this is super important because this is telling the system exactly what it needs. It needs to know which equipment it's going to use, which stage we are in, and the equipment types that are tied to it. How much of that equipment again? So very important to have this. Now, if we weren't in the brewing stage and we needed to change this, we could. We could change it to flavoring if we needed to, or boil, but we are in the brewing stage. We know that we need the equipment tied to the brewing stage, so we're going to keep that. Sequence is just stating that this is the first stage in the order of operations. And then we have our output per turn. So this is saying that per turn, we are making 30 barrels for a total output of 120. So that is why this recipe stage is set to turnable because it is going to repeat 4 times in order to get our total output to 120. So this is perfect. It is set to turnable. That also relates to our default number of turns. So from turnable, we are going to do 4 turns to make an output of 120 barrels. Now, also on the recipe stage, we have our lead time. This is super important because again, it is going to tell the system exactly how long that stage should take. So our brewing process should take 4 hours only. Now, the other important thing we have here is our transfer when complete. This is really important when we are going from our hot side or our brew house side to our cellar side because we need to transfer to maybe a different piece of equipment. We need to transfer to a different location. So, since we are on our brewing stage type and then we are going to our fermenting stage, that's different. That's going from hot house to cold house. So we need to transfer that to a new piece of a fermenting vessel or that new piece of equipment. So we're going to have this toggle true to transfer when complete. So that way it's saying that we are now putting it from this brewing stage equipment into that fermentation vessel. Now, going down, we have our recipe components. There's a few pieces of information we could use here. We could delete it if we don't want. We can edit the memo. We could see our units per turn, total units using a measure, and our timing. So all that important information for each individual recipe component. Now, I already mentioned that the gray is the instructions and the white is the actual source product. So we can go through here. And if we were using our Encompass Mobile, we would go through one by one again. So let's say that we did all this. We included our 0.64 pounds of yeast for our first turn. That's been done. We can continue on. We did it for all of our other products. Now we need to make sure the mash temp is on this. So we're going to go here. We did that. We're going to mark complete on our Encompass Mobile, go to the next instruction, and just follow this on. So again, we have that information that we need, the units, we have the total units, the units of measure, and the timing is really important here. If you need to add a recipe component at a certain time in the stage. So yes, this is going to take 4 hours, but let's say we were really meticulous and we needed to add the malt at minute 15 instead of 0. So we needed to add it at 15 minutes. That's where it would come down here. We would add it at that 15-minute mark instead. So that's where we can go ahead and use that timing to show when it needs to go in. Awesome. So again, we are going to move through our stages, but we are not making this like our typical lager. We are adding some flavoring to this. So we need to go in and make that substitution or make that addition. So from here, we are going to add a recipe stage and it's going to populate this field for us. So our stage type, again, super important because it tells the system exactly what we need when we need it. And I'm going to look for our flavoring because that's how we reference it in my company. That's what we're using because we're adding some flavors. So I'm going to click the flavoring stage type. My output per turn, I'm going to say that this is going to be 120 just because we are not going to make this turnable. The reason why we're not making this turnable is because we don't need to. This is just a flavoring. We don't need to go and brew it multiple times. This is a cold side, so we are just letting it kind of simmer, or not simmer, but really just sit and get those flavors incorporated. So we're not turning this. That's why my output per turn is going to stay at 120 because we're just building to that 120 barrels. Now, our lead time days is also really important. I'm going to say that I want this to get full flavor in 3 days. So this is going to be in the flavoring stage for 3 days. Now I am going to click add recipe and we're going to see it populate, or we did see it populate right here at the bottom. So this new recipe stage automatically populated it. We see it here on that bottom row. Now, the cool thing about this dashboard is I could drag and drop it to where I need it to go in our sequence. So I know flavoring needs to go after fermenting, so I'm just going to hold and drag it up here. And it is now after that fermenting stage. So we brewed it, it's on the hothouse side. We transferred when complete into our fermenting stage. It is now doing its thing. We added our components, we are done, and we are letting this excuse me. We're letting this ferment now for 18 days. Now, from here, I am going to toggle off this transfer when complete just because I know it's already on the cold side and we don't need it to go to really new piece of equipment. Maybe we're using that same fermentation vessel for our flavoring as well. So I'm going to toggle that off. And then after 18 days, it is now going to go into our flavoring stage. So from here, we have our flavoring stage. we are going into our incorporate our blackberries and our lime into this so that way it really soaks in that flavor. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to click add recipe component. So I'm going to add recipe component. I'm going to start with our blackberries. Now for units per turn, again, this is dependent on your use cases. So I'm going to say that I'm going to do 50 pounds of blackberries. And I'm going to keep the timing at 0 just to show that it is going in right as we start the flavoring process. That way it has the most amount of time. So I'm going to keep that at 0. And then I could click save and add recipe component again, but why do an extra step when I could just click save and add another? So you can see it added it down here and I'm able to add another right away. I'm going to go to my lime juice. So I have my lime juice concentrate as well. And let's add some units per turn. I'm going to say here that we are going to do, let's do 15 liters. Maybe I like mine to have more of that front-facing lime juice flavor than I do the blackberry. I want that blackberry to be more subtle and on the back palate. So I'm going to do more lime juice. So I have it for 15 liters. Again, set the timing to 0 because it's going in right at the beginning. And I'm going to click save. So right here we see in our flavoring stage, we added those two recipe components. We have our units, our total units, our timing. That is all ready to go. Now, let's say that we needed to add some instructions to this as well. Let's say that we wanted to add an instruction at the very end saying, I want the remaining blackberries to be removed. I'm going to set the timing for 3 days because I want to take these out at the 3 day mark. This timing is in minutes, so I'm going to say 4,320. That's 4,320 minutes. And then the sequence, I'm going to leave it as it is because it's just going to populate at the bottom of this, which is perfect. Because we have that timing, that's what's really matters. So I added that instruction there. So after they added the products and the 3 days comes up, our users are going to see that we need to remove the remaining blackberries at that 3 day mark. Now we could also add another instruction, maybe say stir. Whoop, stir the flavors. Let's do that. Again, I'm going to do that at that 3 day mark. And we have two pieces of instructions right there. Now, if you wanted to, you could combine these and say remove blackberries and stir. That's just best use case for you guys. That's dependent if you want your handheld users to only have one piece of instruction and make sure that they do both, or if you like to break it up and make sure that they're doing it one by one, that's where you would separate them. So we continued, we added our flavoring, we're transferring when complete because we are moving into our last stage where our bright beer is becoming it. So we need to go in, that's a whole different set of equipment. So I'm transferring that when complete. And then we are in our brightening stage and we're moving on with that production order. So everything looks good and we are going to continue on through our day and we're making this blackberry lime lager. So I'm excited for it. So that is the recipe management dashboard. I'm going to hop back here to our demo just to kind of end us with some key takeaways. Again, the recipe structure is really important. We have those three main pieces in the structure, which is our recipe version. That's going to be the master template or the blueprint. Then we have our recipe stages. These are going to be the sequential steps, and that houses our stage types as far as our production stage types, our equipment types, and all that other key pieces of information. We then have our recipe components. Those are going to be our actual ingredients or our instructions that make up the stage. And then we want to make sure that we look through the production flow. So we want to make sure that our recipe version is so close to perfect or perfect as it is. That way we can move through our production orders. We can use our single whip process, or we can go and add a little bit more to it. We just want to make sure that it is in a great state. So that way we can add more, take away, anything like that. And then lastly, that whip management. So if you have your single whip and you're using it from start to finish from that grain to glass, do it. We know what goes into it. We know how it should work. We know what people like, so we keep it that way. If we need to add a few flavorings or a few additional pieces, create that multiple whip. If we need to make 3 sours, let's go make 3 sours from our base brew. So, few key takeaways that we can use here that should be really useful in your company. And with that, I'm going to open the floor to any questions. And I don't see any lingering or questions that came up. So I'm going to go ahead and close out this session. But I want to thank everybody for joining today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.